History has lied to us. When we imagine slavery, we see the brutal lash of white men, the auction block, the endless fields of cotton. But what if I told you the deepest wounds were sometimes inflicted in secret behind closed doors by those we least suspect? White women. History remembers them as delicate, fragile, untouchable, the image of purity, the picture of innocence. But in the shadowed corners of America's plantations, some of them were something else entirely. They were not the powerless victims of the system. They were part of it. They fed it, they benefited from it, and in ways hidden by silence, they weaponized it. Slavery was not only the field, the whip, or the chains. It was also the unspoken terror of the night, when the mistress of the house would summon an enslaved black man into her room. He could not say no. He could not turn away. Refusal wasn't just disobedience. It was a death sentence. In that moment, she wasn't fragile. She wasn't powerless. She was the law. The world outside saw her as a symbol of virtue. Inside the walls of her house, she carried a power few dared to imagine. She needed no overseer, no whip of leather. All she needed was her word. A whisper against him. He touched me. He defied me. He disrespected me. And the fury of white men, the law, and the entire system of slavery would fall upon his head like a storm. This was the invisible whip. The kind that left no visible scars but cut just as deep. The kind that forced enslaved men into silence for centuries, their stories buried, their pain erased. Imagine his life. A man born into chains, stripped of family, dignity, and freedom. By day, he labors in the fields until sweat burns his eyes and his hands crack open from endless work. By night, when he dreams of rest, he faces another terror. The quiet footsteps outside his cabin. The mistress's shadow at his door. Her request is not a request. It is a command. He obeys, not because he wants to, but because he must. Because survival means silence, his heart pounds. His body obeys what his soul rejects. Every moment is a violation, and yet he carries the blame. He cannot speak of it. He cannot confide in anyone. If he tells his fellow slaves, they too risk punishment if the secret spreads. If he tells the master, he risks death. If he says nothing, he carries the weight forever. This is how the system worked. With silence, with fear, with shame. And history, in its cruel selectivity, chose to erase this silence. White women were remembered as angels, caretakers, martyrs. But behind closed doors, many became predators with untouchable protection. The power was always stacked against him. She had a shield no man could pierce. Whiteness, womanhood, and law. Society refused to see her as an abuser, and so her victims remained invisible. Their cries were swallowed by time. Their stories dismissed as impossible, their pain left unrecorded. But the truth cannot stay buried forever. In rare testimonies, in scattered whispers from old slave narratives, fragments of this hidden abuse appear. A sentence here, a memory there, always guarded, always hesitant. Because even in freedom, the shame and danger lingered. One former slave remembered how his mistress would call upon him in secret, and how he lived with a constant fear that one day she would accuse him of something he never did. Another hinted at relations forced upon him by his owner's wife, describing the humiliation as worse than the lash. These accounts are rare, but they exist, and they open a door into the darkness history wanted us to forget. Think of the psychology of it. For enslaved men, masculinity was already stripped away by the system. They were denied the right to protect their families, to choose their partners, even to control their own labor. And then, to be forced into intimacy under threat by the very women society claimed were pure was another layer of destruction. It tore at their identity, their dignity, their manhood. It was not only physical abuse. It was psychological warfare. The world did not see it because it did not want to. White femininity had to remain pure in the narrative of slavery. The white man could be a monster, but the white woman had to be a victim. And so history silenced these voices. But silence does not mean absence. Silence does not mean innocence. The absence of stories and books does not erase the truth in memory. For generations, the descendants of enslaved men carried that silence, often without words, in the heavy pauses of family histories, in the pain that could not be explained, in the wounds that were never spoken aloud. This is the untold story, the hidden abuse, the betrayal of innocence. It is a reminder that slavery was not only about labor, or chains, or the whip. It was about the complete domination of human beings, body, mind, and soul. And sometimes that domination came from the hands of those the world swore could do no wrong. So when we look back at slavery and imagine only the brutality of men, we must also remember this truth, that power wears many faces and not all of them are male. The mistress with her soft hands and quiet voice could be just as dangerous as the master with his whip. Her power lay in secrecy, in silence, in the fact that no one believed she could do harm, and that is what made her the most dangerous of all. Slavery was not only about chains, fields, and auctions. It was also a theater of power. Every role was carefully scripted, every gesture designed to maintain a cruel balance that kept human beings trapped in submission. On that stage, the white man was the master, the overseer, the judge. But in the background, hidden in the corners of history, the white woman also played her part. She wasn't just watching the play unfold, she was part of it. Sometimes silent, sometimes commanding, and sometimes far more dangerous than anyone would admit. The plantation was its own universe, a world built on control, on the strict separation of who had rights and who did not. The master held the law in his hands, but the mistress held the keys to the house, the kitchen, the children, the daily life of the enslaved. For enslaved men, this meant that power pressed down from every direction. The whip cracked in the fields, but the quiet demands of the mistress echoed inside the walls. To the outside world, she appeared powerless. White women were often described as victims of patriarchy, as fragile beings shielded by their husbands. But on the plantation, her fragility was a mask. Behind it lay authority. Authority she used in ways both visible and invisible. She directed the domestic staff, punished disobedience, and reminded enslaved men and women that her word was law within the household. And when her desires clashed with the boundaries society had drawn, she found ways to bend the rules in her favor. Enslaved men lived under this constant contradiction. By day, they saw her presented as an image of virtue. By night, they experienced her as something else entirely. If she summoned them, they could not refuse. If she touched them, they could not resist. And if they dared to hesitate, she could ruin them with nothing more than a whispered accusation. This imbalance was more than physical. It was psychological. Imagine standing in a room where you are both desired and despised, where your body is demanded but your humanity is denied. For enslaved men, this was the ultimate trap. They were told they were inferior, animalistic, dangerous, yet in the same breath, forced into intimacy under the guise of silence. They became objects of both attraction and disgust, condemned no matter how they responded. The white woman's advantage was absolute. Her reputation was untouchable. If she cried out even falsely, her word carried infinite weight. And so she wielded this weapon silently, knowing that society would never suspect her, never blame her, never accuse her of wrongdoing. Think of the fear that lived in the heart of an enslaved man walking down the hallway toward her room. He knew there was no choice. He knew that every step was a step into a trap. He could not say no, and he could not say yes. Both paths led to destruction. What does a man become when even his choices are stolen? History rarely recorded these moments, but the few glimpses we have show us the depth of this silent war. Some narratives spoke in hints and half-phrases, as if the memory itself was too dangerous to speak aloud. A man might say that his mistress took interest in him, or that he was called upon at night. These words carry shadows heavier than they appear. Behind them lies a story of coercion, of forced silence, of pain that the world refused to hear. And when these men were accused, falsely or otherwise, the punishment was brutal. A look, a touch, even the rumor of intimacy between a black man and a white woman could end in lynching, mutilation, or public execution. The very relationship forced upon him in private could be twisted into a weapon against him in public. It was a trap from which there was no escape. This is why silence became survival. To speak was death. To resist was death. To submit was survival. But survival that came with its own scars. The scars of shame, of humiliation, of a stolen sense of manhood that could never fully heal. When we look back at history, we often search for evidence in books, in laws, in testimonies. But what about the evidence that never made it to paper? What about the stories erased by fear, by shame, by the need to survive? The silence itself is evidence. The absence is a trace. And when we learn to listen to that silence, we begin to understand the hidden theater of slavery, a stage where power was performed not just by men, but by women cloaked in innocence. The world protected them. The law defended them. Society painted them as angels. But behind that curtain of purity, they played roles far darker. The world protected them. The law defended them. Society painted them as angels. But behind that curtain of purity, they played roles far darker. They became the keepers of secrets, the silent wielders of power that could destroy a man without lifting a hand. In the quiet of the night, in rooms lit by dim candles, the forbidden unfolded. White women carried a desire that society told them they could never admit. Their world demanded they remain untouched, modest, chaste, the embodiment of virtue. But desire does not die because society commands it. It hides, it twists, it finds shadows to live in. And on the plantation, the shadows were the enslaved black men who had no power to refuse. These encounters were not whispered love affairs, as some might imagine. They were not stories of romance hidden from public view. They were acts of domination disguised as desire, of coercion disguised as intimacy. For the enslaved man, there was no choice. His body was commanded like his labor, taken like his sweat, stolen like his freedom. He walked into those rooms with a weight heavier than chains. If he obeyed, he carried shame. If he resisted, he carried death. His very existence was trapped in this impossible balance. Even in the silence of his own mind, he could not escape the humiliation. Every glance at his mistress in daylight reminded him of the nights he wished he could forget. And when rumors stirred, when whispers of forbidden closeness spread through the plantation, it was never she who faced punishment. It was always him. A white woman's virtue was too sacred to stain, and so the stain was painted onto the enslaved man instead. He was branded the predator, the animal, the threat, even when he had been the victim. This was the cruel paradox. The same woman who demanded his body in secret could destroy him in public with a single accusation. One scream, one word, and his life could end beneath the lash, or at the end of a rope, while her innocence remained untouched in the eyes of the world. The abuse left no records. Because it left no need for records, society did not want to see it. Historians of the time looked away. Laws offered no recognition, and so the truth survived only in fragments, in the haunted tones of rare testimonies, in the shame that trickled through generations, in the silence that echoed louder than any words. Yet the truth is clear when you strip away the myths. These women were not powerless spectators in the system of slavery. They were actors in it. They shaped it. They enforced it. And some of them twisted it to satisfy desires forbidden by the very world that protected them. For enslaved black men, the plantation was more than chains and whips. It was a trap of impossible choices. Their bodies belonged to the master in daylight and to the mistress in the secrecy of night. Every breath, every movement, every moment was governed by the will of others. And in this unending theater of power, there was no curtain call, no exit, no relief. The world would never know how many men carried these hidden scars. The records remain incomplete, the stories half buried. But we know enough to understand one truth, that slavery's cruelty was not only in the fields, not only in the hands of men, but also in the quiet rooms where innocence wore a mask, and power whispered in the voice of a woman no one dared to accuse. They called her innocent. They called her fragile. They said she was too pure for cruelty, too weak for violence. This was the myth of white womanhood, a myth protected like a sacred scripture. In painting, she appeared as a saintly figure. In books, she was praised as virtuous, and in the collective imagination, she was untouchable. But myths are dangerous when they hide the truth. And this myth was a shield that covered sins committed in silence. Whenever abuse was whispered about, society turned away. The law refused to see. To even suggest that a white woman could force herself upon a black man was unthinkable. How could the angel become the predator? How could the delicate flower hold a whip of shame? The answer was simple. Society refused to believe it. And in that refusal, silence grew, silence that swallowed generations of pain. But sometimes the silence cracked. In rare moments, voices of the enslaved broke through. In slave narratives, carefully worded lines hinted at secrets too dangerous to say aloud. An enslaved man would write that his mistress called him in the night. Another would recall how he lived in constant fear that a single accusation could destroy him. Their words were not loud, not detailed, but behind them echoed a truth too heavy to carry openly. Even in freedom, many could not speak of it directly. The shame clung to them like chains that had never been broken. These testimonies, fragile as they are, shine light on what history tried to erase. They remind us that slavery was not only physical labor, but a total assault on dignity. It stripped men not only of their freedom, but of their right to their own bodies. Forced intimacy with a woman protected by law and myth was not intimacy at all. It was humiliation disguised as desire, violation disguised as silence, and the scars ran deeper than the skin. The whip cut the flesh, but this wound cut the soul. Imagine the psychological torment of living with a secret you could never tell. Imagine carrying the weight of shame for something you never chose. The mind becomes its own prison. Some men carried that silence to their graves. Some passed it down in the form of unspoken pain, in families who could feel the wound without knowing its name. This was the invisible legacy, trauma that stretched beyond one lifetime, beyond one generation. It is easy for history to record battles, laws, and names. But how do you record silence? How do you measure a pain that was never allowed to speak? That is the challenge of this truth. It lives between the lines, in the pauses, in the things left unsaid. And yet, once you begin to see it, it becomes impossible to ignore. Slavery was a system designed to control every part of a person, their labor, their movements, their choices, their relationships, their very identity. The abuse by white women was another chain, another weapon, another way of saying, you own nothing, not even yourself. And when society insisted on protecting the myth of innocence, it only tightened the silence, forcing men to carry the unbearable weight alone. This is why remembering matters. This is why telling these stories matters. Because the silence was part of the crime. The world erased their voices, but if we listen closely, if we look at the fragments, we can still hear them. They are telling us that the cruelty of slavery was deeper than we were taught. They are telling us that power does not always look like a whip in a man's hand. Sometimes it looks like a smile behind a curtain, a whisper in the dark, a word that could kill. And they are telling us something else, that the shame was never theirs to carry. It belonged to the world that refused to see. It belonged to the system that protected innocence at the cost of truth. It belonged to the history that chose to remain blind. The voices of the enslaved may be few, but their silence speaks louder than words. It tells us of nights that history buried, of wounds that cannot be measured, of trauma that still lingers in the bones of generations. It tells us of power that wore the mask of weakness, and of men who survived a war that was fought not only in fields and on chains, but in the hidden rooms where silence itself became the deadliest weapon of all. Generations passed, but silence did not disappear. The wounds of slavery were carried forward, not always in words, but in the quiet heaviness inside families. The trauma of those secret nights was inherited in ways that could not be seen, but could be felt. Some men never spoke of what was done to them, but their silence shaped the way they raised their sons, the way they looked at their wives, the way they carried themselves. Shame that was never theirs to begin with became part of their bloodline, a shadow passed from father to son, a silence handed down like an heirloom no one wanted but no one could throw away. The abuse of white women against enslaved black men rarely appeared in history books, but its effects were written in the fabric of families. Generational trauma is not always a scream. Sometimes it is the pause in a conversation, the anger that has no clear source, the distrust that lingers without explanation. For descendants of the enslaved, these invisible chains remained long after the physical ones were broken. The body may have been freed, but the soul carried wounds that freedom could not heal. For centuries, historians ignored this. They wrote about slavery as a story of men and their power, the master with the whip, the overseer in the fields. The white woman remained in the background, painted as the victim of patriarchy, not the participant in cruelty. It was safer that way. It preserved the myth of her innocence. It allowed society to keep pretending that purity lived in her hands. But some scholars began to look closer. They read between the lines of slave narratives. They questioned the myths. They asked why so many accounts spoke of silence, of shame, of fear that seemed to reach beyond the whip. And slowly a different picture emerged. A picture of white women not as powerless dolls, but as actors in the machinery of slavery. A picture of secret abuse hidden under the cover of innocence. Breaking this myth is painful. It means admitting that history lied. It means confronting the fact that abuse came not only from the lash of men, but also from the whispered commands of women. It means tearing down the pedestal on which white womanhood was placed and seeing it not as untouchable purity, but as a mask that hid darker truths. And still, many resist this truth. Even today,